Welcome to Gas, the true story of a toxic train derailment. I'm Ron Scholl. Last time on Gas, we considered all of the evidence surrounding the Alberton derailment and the obstruction of the EPA and other government agencies and responders in the immediate days following the derailment to offer a reasoned explanation for the Montana Rail Link derailment and the obstruction. We now continue with Part 6, Chapters 27 and 28. Chapter 27, Settling. Epigraph. A long and tortuous path. MRL attorney Randy Cox. After the Austin verdict, plaintiffs understood that awards could be less than what MRL offered for settlement, especially factoring growing attorney costs. For core members of ACCEH, the money mattered because they felt permanently harmed by the exposure and had incurred various financial costs along with uncertain futures. Lucinda Hodges heard a rumor in early 2000 that Lion wanted $200 million total for 40-some people, plus punitive damages. Next came reality. In a September 2000 settlement conference, Lion sought $23 million for 58 plaintiffs. By 2001, Lion sought about $10 million. That March, before the Austin trial, MRL and BNSF attorneys offered Lion a global settlement sum of $4.5 million for an estimated 87 plaintiffs, an average of $51,724, with specific allocations left up to the plaintiffs. The substantial majority of the cases are not worth that amount, Cox wrote Lion and Grady Chandler. This was a best and final offer, prior to trial and a ruling on punitive damages. While the possibility of sizable verdicts still drove MRL to attempt settlement resolutions, Cox told Lion, "We are fully prepared to try as many of the cases as necessary." Unfortunately for Lion, his neurological injury expert, Dr. Kilburn, had been excluded, and Lion developed no chemical sensitivity case per se. Cox noted, "We are struck by the lack of medical evidence as to the vast majority of plaintiffs. RADS diagnoses have been made in 11 cases, none of which MRL recognized. You have 34 plaintiffs whom we regard as having damages in the range of $0 to $5,000, Cox said. $4.5 million was plenty fair, he wrote. If the cases are not settled now, Cox warned, we will embark on a long and tortuous path during which you will continue to work and your clients will continue to have no money. He foresaw trials and appeals over several years before anyone got a dime. You should understand that we have made our choice. We will continue litigating even if it costs more in order to avoid overpaying these cases, he said. As for the current $4.5 million offer, that value evaporates if we are compelled to begin trying cases. In the final analysis, it comes down to how much you are willing to bet on big verdicts in Austin and the first Griffin case, and a reversal of Judge McLean's rulings on appeal, Cox said. Austin was considered Lion's best case. I respectfully suggest that if you do not get a verdict of more than $500,000 and you do not recover punitive damages, you have gained nothing, Cox said. If a jury returns a verdict of less than $300,000 in Austin, and you have not recovered punitive damages, I can assure you that our settlement offer for the remaining cases will decrease. MRL had thrown down the gauntlet. Take the $4.5 million or prepare for a long and tortuous path. Lion snubbed the offer, writing to plaintiffs on the eve of Austin that MRL's offer was ridiculously low. After the Austin trial, expectations went decidedly south. Beaten, Lion sought the $4.5 million MRL had earlier offered. Plaintiffs began to squabble as it sunk in how little money would be delegated among them. I just think it's coming out badly, Hodges said that May. No matter what happens at this point, it's not going to be pretty. It's been kind of a downer for everybody, Hodges said. By late May, Lion wanted everyone to sign off on a gross figure from MRL that they would divvy up later. We're not signing till we get the bottom line, Hodges said of her family's share. Even $100,000 wouldn't clear her debt or keep her from declaring bankruptcy. The past 2 months have been such total hell for me. I'm relieved to have that over, Hodges said. if it's really going to be over. I think I am semi-relieved. I would have rather it worked out differently, of course, but at least there will be some closure on that level. And if it does work out and I get the settlement money, I'm moving. That would help my life a lot to get out of this trailer. It's just miserable here. Why stay 1 minute longer than I have to? Hodges had exclusively endured the cramped trailer since she fled Alberton for good in early 1997. Hodges signed. I took the settlement for myself and my kids because I didn't want to risk getting nothing. I finally got everything that I wanted, but it took being a real bitch to get it. In June 2001, Lyon settled 79 individual claims, leaving 8 unsettled, and he reported to the media the money was substantial, but less than what he had sought. Since Cox had said the $4.5 million for 87 plaintiffs would be void after Austin, presumably the final average was less than the previous $51,724 per person. And with about 40% of that going to attorneys and costs, the average less than $34,000. In comparison, however, the majority of spill victims who settled claims without litigation received much less. While Hodges' husband, Mark Hansen, was one of the 8 holdouts, his claim was for property damage only. Of the other holdouts, the Ringlaub family opted for arbitration. The Walshes went to trial. Hansen wouldn't sign because the settlement was paltry. He's not even getting enough money to pay the debt on that house, Hodges said. Her husband had documented nothing medical. He's just getting what a large group are getting. They're calling it nuisance money for being inconvenienced, and that's why he won't settle, because we're stuck with that damn piece of property, a house she couldn't live in. Even if they could pay off the mortgage, Hodges felt the property was contaminated, and we would never be able to get another mortgage on it, she said. If they wanted to keep the land, she felt the house would have to be demolished. Hodges signed off on June 20. The next day, Deb Griffin traveled to Missoula with her kids. Reunited, Hodges and Griffin took their families up to Lolo Hot Springs to celebrate. They had always promised they'd go to Baja someday, but this discount trip would have to do. The money wouldn't come until later, and there was still a hearing in July regarding rights of minors and parents settling for them. Hodges got, quote, everything I wanted, but she meant relative to the finite settlement pot. She still had her unwanted illness. With spill-induced debt and continued suffering, the money was nothing to enjoy. Despite her hopes to move, her family had accumulated a great deal of debt, and she would remain in her cramped trailer for years to come. Having settled, what was left to fight for? Many had wanted to get to the truth of what had happened. Beverly Ridenour once told Ted Lyon, I may not get a damn dime out of this, but by God, I'm going to get some answers, or I'm going to die getting them. The answer was chronic illness. Chronic illness after being told there should be no chronic illness. And the truth seemed a derailment and toxic exposure that shouldn't have even happened. After the Chalmers settlement, Ada said they didn't get the compensation they wanted, but they had decided to move on. Roger ended his crusade to prove wrongdoing, imagined or otherwise. Every book was closed, except the personal stories of each and every victim, still being written every day. Barbara Dudley of Greenpeace once told Hodges, I don't think there is such a thing as just compensation for the kinds of experiences you've all had. You do it because you want to stop some total malfeasant from doing the same thing to other people. That's what it's all about. Money isn't going to make up for when your land is poisoned and your children are made sick. In the summer of 2001, Hodges' phone rang again, but now like a death knell. I've had a number of calls, she said. I felt like people are like somebody has died when the lawsuit ended this way, that I'm getting these sympathy calls. One was from Dr. Kay Kilburn. The thing that struck me, though, is he said, I don't want Alberton to get lost because, he said, I think it's one of the more powerful tales that needs to be told as far as chemical injury. I just think he feels as beat up on this issue as the victims do. Kilburn failed to have his Alberton neurological findings heard in court. I think that's such a loss to anybody, Hodges said, because I believe in his work. Sometimes the only justice comes through telling the story. Chapter 28. Testimony. Epigraph. It's an organic thing that happens. Every part of your body. It's like being mutated. Lucinda Hodges. Hodges' children improved after fleeing Alberton in the spring of 1997. But like their mother, they didn't leave their hypersensitivity behind. By the end of the year, they were too ill to maintain their schoolwork. Before Christmas break, 8-year-old Jesse had a frightening asthma attack at Hellgate Elementary after walking by an office being painted. Hodges hadn't realized how serious his breathing problems had become. He was a wreck, she said. He was panicked and couldn't understand why he could not breathe. He was barely getting any oxygen, but he said he felt better the minute he went out of the building. This was Jesse's first breathing attack, and no one had yet diagnosed asthma. In hindsight, Hodges realized he'd shown signs of chronic asthma, including raccoon eyes. Hodges demanded Jesse be given an inhaler from his doctor. Lisa Mosca interviewed Trask Hodges in 1998 when he was almost 12 years old. He told her he couldn't swim in chlorinated pools. His knees and legs sometimes badly hurt. He sometimes had stomach problems, and his throat always hurt and felt a little swollen. I notice lots of chemicals mainly. It bothers me, he said. Headaches, sometimes when I'm around pesticides. For a couple seconds, I'll feel real numb, and then I'll feel nauseous. The school uses chemicals and stuff to clean the floors. It sometimes bothers me a lot. By the spring of 1998, Trask and Jesse both suffered a series of costly infections. Jesse contracted a flesh-eating strep bacterial infection. I spent thousands of dollars, Hodges said. That was the worst time medically. We just couldn't get Jesse well. He took expensive antibiotics for about 6 weeks. By the second spill anniversary, her kids looked terrible, with drawn faces and constantly runny noses. While Trask seemed to improve, Jesse got worse. Even though he was run down, she said, Trask finished the school year, but Jesse couldn't even handle 2 hours a day by that May. He had pains in his joints, got headaches, eye infections. The whole year he was in Hellgate, he was getting thinner and thinner and thinner. By staying home and resting, he started to reverse that and grow like a normal kid, she said. Hodges began homeschooling. Jesse saw different doctors, but none diagnosed respiratory disease. One allergist said he needed to practice breathing. His results couldn't be as bad as they appeared. Jesse's pulmonary function was 40%, and his upper airway was about 18% of normal. He basically was saying that Jesse was faking due to emotional problems, Hodges said. He finally said, if I get him a lung x-ray and it's okay, will that satisfy you? The lung x-ray showed that Jesse had 2 types of lung scarring. That was an awful period of time, she said, because it took years for Jesse to be properly diagnosed. In 1999, in addition to his neurological battery, Dr. Kay Kilburn did a pulmonary function test on Jesse, and the results were within 1 or 2 percentage points of the allergist tests. But Kilburn believed the test, Hodges said. He said, you've got to get him help, and you've got to get it to him now. Kilburn advised that any lung scarring would be permanent. And his brain damage problems are consistent with chemical exposure too. The balance, the vertical, the coordination problems, from Kilburn's testing, Hodges said. Hodges said both she and Jesse were eventually diagnosed with toxic encephalopathy, or swelling of the brain from exposure to toxic chemicals. The allergist began treating Jesse immediately and gave a long explanation as to why he hadn't treated earlier. Because he has to be careful that there isn't a conflict of interest, Hodges said, that it doesn't seem like he's just trying to make money off the Alberton clients. He said he couldn't treat Jesse until he was absolutely sure. But Jesse's peak flows were so low the day that Dr. Kilburn tested, he didn't even register in the peak flow meter. That kid has just lived for years without oxygen, and the doctors weren't even recognizing that. I wasn't either for a long time, but I knew something wasn't right. Evidently, it's very hard to recognize these problems and get them diagnosed correctly. I will say that. By 2000, Jesse's average peak flow had improved, but still below normal for his age. Jesse was healthy prior to the spill, Hodges said. Now he didn't go anywhere without his box of 3 inhalers. Life had changed. We took him snowboarding one time for half a day, and he was sick the whole next week. He had to use the nebulizer all the time. He won't go back and try it again. It was just too hard on him, Hodges said. Physical activity left Jesse extremely fatigued. When Hodges or Trask smelled chlorine in a store, they would leave. With his chronic sinus blockage, Jesse couldn't smell anymore. He may get exposed to stuff he has no idea. I think that's part of his problem, she said. As Trask says, Jesse really was a victim. In her 2004 testimony for a congressional hearing concerning neurodevelopmental diseases, Hodges wrote the following on Jesse. Diagnosis due to acute chemical exposure, April 11, 1996. Toxic encephalopathy, or swelling of the brain. Interstitial lung scarring. RADS, reactive airway disease. Asthma. Peripheral neuropathy. Balance disorder. CFIDS, chronic fatigue immune deficiency syndrome. Fibromyalgia. GERD, gastroesophageal reflux disease. Various eye diseases. Acquired ADD, anemia, chloracne. She continued, symptoms, difficulty breathing, chronic respiratory infections, sinusitis, dizziness, vertigo, muscle and joint pain, chronic fatigue, blurred and double vision, nausea, diarrhea, gastrointestinal pain, headaches, multiple chemical sensitivity, light and sun sensitivity, decreased motor skills, dry eyes, loss of balance, loss of ability to concentrate, loss of touch sensation in hands and feet, loss of peripheral vision, chronic bacteria, yeast, and fungal infections, short-term memory loss, tremors, decreased word usage, skin outbreaks. By 2001, Hodges said, Jesse was completely dependent on steroids, inhalers, and frequent nebulizer treatments to support and sustain his ability to breathe. His upper lung capacity was marginal, about 17% of normal. He was too ill to attend public school and so physically reactive to environmental pollutants it was difficult for him to leave his home for any reason. Desperate, Hodges took Jesse to California for treatment. Dr. Gunnar Heuser had begun a study of the potential benefits of MHBOT, mild hyperbaric oxygen therapy, on chemical brain injury in October of 2001 and chose Jesse as a candidate. Hodges testified, after only 10 MHBOT sessions in 2 weeks, Jesse was suffering fewer headaches and visual disturbances. In short, he looked and felt better for the first time in over 5 years. Mild hyperbaric oxygen therapy saved Jesse's life, she said. Jesse has sustained many of the improvements first experienced through hyperbaric oxygen therapy. But a full recovery is still an unmet promise, due to lack of local access to a hyperbaric chamber and denied insurance coverage. Hodges testified to ask Congress to support research, education, access, and insurance coverage for hyperbaric oxygen therapy. By 2000, Trask improved. His lung capacity was about 80% without medications, and he sometimes took albuterol and a nasal steroid. Trask had chemical sensitivity, but managed through avoidance. His headaches and tremors had stopped. Gilbert had detected just 2 or 3 neurological abnormalities and wasn't concerned, whereas Jesse had 7 and Hodges had 12. Trask's vision finally improved, Hodges felt, to pre-spill level. Skin problems that were bad the second and third year, butterfly facial rashes and the painful MRL scalp bumps, had gone away. The whole family had suffered the bumps. Dr. Mary Stranahan called them chloracne. But when Trask did have an exposure, he became ill. In late 2000, after 2 years of homeschooling, Trask again wanted to try the public school system. Then in December, he had an exposure to cleaning products near the lunchroom that sent him to the school nurse. An exposure to bleach on the school bus in early January made him ill enough to miss the rest of the school week. In early February, Trask was accidentally splashed with a large container of soap at school, sending him to a doctor. Hodges wrote the Hellgate Middle School principal to make sure the school understood the implications of chemical exposures. I would like to request that if the school will be spraying pesticides inside or outside, that I be contacted in writing at least 3 days in advance so that we can make arrangements for Trask not to be in attendance at those times. The same applies for any indoor painting. Essentially, she said, paints, pesticides, cleaning products, and bleach exposures will make Trask very sick. Trask and Jesse, the lives of chemically sensitized children. Nearly 4 years after the spill, Hodges assessed her own health and laughed stoically. "Oh my God, I've just been a wreck. I have," she said. But she immediately improved after leaving her Alberton home the spring of 1997. Now, the worst of daily life seemed to be fatigue. Any physical activity brought on fatigue with muscle and joint pain, but it wasn't constant as in Alberton. "I've noticed and have verified with Kilburn that I just don't think as well," she added. She forgot words. She also had some vision problems and in recent months, migraines that she never had before. "It's totally changed my life," she said. "I don't see myself as a healthy person like I did before the spill. I'd be out with my kids on the slopes. There's no way I could do that now." To cope, she stayed at home to avoid exposure to common chemicals. The last time she had a, quote, major Alberton exposure was in 1998. Her lawyers needed tax documents her husband couldn't find, so she went to their house on Railroad Avenue. Within minutes of stepping inside, she had double vision, headache, tremors, and loss of muscle control. Then she started to lose sensation in her hands and feet. For weeks afterward, she experienced headaches and body pain. These flu-like symptoms usually lasted 10 to 14 days after a bad exposure. The symptoms are hard to explain, Hodges told Mosca that year, because they change all the time. The overwhelming fatigue, what it's like, from the time that I was exposed, it's like your body is changing, and it's not your own anymore. You lose control of your body. On a very cellular level, your metabolism, everything, is being totally rewired by the chemicals. I think it's very hard for people to understand that. I would not have understood it at all if I had not lived it. You can't just list these symptoms and say, well, I have a cold and I get headaches. That isn't adequate. It's an organic thing that happens. Every part of your body, your brain, your circulation, the way you digest food, the way you smell food, everything that happens to you. It's like being mutated. We all have these terrible symptoms that come and go with our exposure and our lifestyle. I was a person who would walk 4 to 5 miles every day and feel invigorated by that. Now I can't walk a block before feeling fatigued and joint pain, and that's setting off a pain syndrome that for me will last sometimes 10 days. That's the radical change that the spill has made. Hodges added, as a couple of years have gone by, my symptoms have changed with time. Some are worse, some are not, but what I've noticed the most is the chemical sensitivity. In 1999, Hodges and Beverly Ridenour met with attorneys in downtown Missoula, and something in the office affected her. Maybe clean carpets, she thought. Perfume set her off too. The reaction that day was similar, but not as bad as in Alberton. The dullness in your head, she said, the slurring words, not thinking right, loss of sensation in her hands. That day, I could feel it happening, but I really wanted to hear what the attorneys had to say. Usually I don't get that because I have the flight reaction. You can feel it happening, so you leave. She was sick for a couple weeks after that exposure. Pesticides are my worst chemical, Hodges said. It triggers the joint pain, all that. Fatigue and eye problems lasted a couple days. And you see, the symptoms are always changing, she said. But when I get an exposure now, I feel that swelling and my face swells up. Sinuses swell. She'd lose her voice every night. Once you've been through it for years, she said, it's so distinctive. The difference between a cold and the flu and an exposure. You've lived it and you know the difference. And this is harder to shake. But the first year nighttime attacks, insomnia, waking up and not being able to breathe, being in constant pain, that was gone, left behind in Alberton. That was hell, she said. I don't know how I lived through that. I should have been hospitalized or something. Her cramped Missoula trailer was her refuge from chemical exposure. I've survived by totally changing my lifestyle, Hodges said. No health official ever elaborated on possible symptoms or said people might live with sensitivity for years or the rest of their lives. Sensitivity to returning to the Alberton area was not considered a health concern. Officials just said people might notice, people might be bothered. Now, sensitivity following a toxic exposure seemed to Hodges as obvious a concern as decontamination, but they hadn't done that either. All the Missoula doctors were just telling me that I was crazy, Hodges said. It hurts you psychologically to keep hearing that when you're so ill. For a long time, Hodges had not trusted local doctors. Dr. Stranahan in the Flathead Valley was a believer in chemical sensitivity, and Hodges said, "She has been the closest thing to treatment that I have found in Montana. She says you can't treat it, there's no cure, but she tried to experiment with things she thinks will mitigate and make me feel more comfortable. Have less pain, have more energy. She can't solve it, and she admits that." Dr. Gordon Baker, an asthma specialist in Seattle referred by Stranahan, ruled out allergies. The only treatment seemed to be coping mechanisms of how to avoid or minimize exposures. All the doctors say that if I want to feel better, I should stay away from environmental exposures, Hodges said. Baker told her, if you don't work, you're better off. He said the people who do work, such as people in the airline industry or auto body industry, they don't make it. They die. Stay in a clean environment and you can survive, though perhaps without a job. Concerned as well about brain damage, in 1998, at Glenda Giles' behest, Hodges saw neurologist-psychologist Dr. Richard Nelson in Billings, who recommended diagnostic testing. Nelson referred her to get a PET scan in California in early 1999. It gave the first visual proof that she was sick, and this gave her some emotional strength to cope with her physical problems. From the PET scan, which measured electrical impulses in the brain, doctors diagnosed brain damage. So now I knew what I had felt, that my brain didn't work right anymore, Hodges said. The basic diagnosis was toxic encephalitis from chemical exposure, a permanent, irreversible swelling in parts of her brain. Dr. Kilburn told her the scan revealed the effects of scar tissue. Kilburn said that following a downturn, people tended to stabilize 3 to 5 years after an acute chemical exposure. But beyond that, he couldn't prognosticate. Hodges said of her chemical illness experience, "It's like night and day when you go from Missoula doctors to any of these other doctors. Away from Montana, doctors treat you as if you are a real person with a real medical problem." Prior to settlement, her attorneys paid for most of the travel expenses, and she felt lucky to get medical testing that few other Alberton victims had. She estimated her total medical bills since the spill to be $80,000, and medical insurance had paid for 80%. Over 90% of the people in Alberton couldn't afford it, she said, and you have to know where to go, which took a long time to find out. It took a while to feel well enough to travel, she said, and be tested out of town. Deb Griffin often told Hodges that she wasn't well enough to get treatment. She needed treatment to come to her. Griffin could not travel alone. Unless for legal reasons, Hodges foresaw no further health testing. None of it had really made her life any better, except she had a better understanding of what made her sick and how best to avoid it. Mark Hansen's head trauma from the brutal attack in 1998 complicated any diagnosis. But until that violence, Hodges said, he was never as sick as the kids and I. Mark had always functioned since the spill. He could work 8 hours, though he did get headaches, sinus infections, and a lot of stomach problems and intestinal cramps, for which he was hospitalized a couple of times. But the lawyers don't think they can link that to the exposure, Hodges said. But his losses lie in that the spill totally destroyed our family. They didn't live like a family since the spill, and Hansen was often absent. He's totally committed to not losing the property in Alberton that's toxic, in which I can't live in, Hodges said. I can't explain that. It's a male thing, I guess. To him, you just don't abandon property, no matter what the circumstances. He feels that eventually, Emerald's going to make it right. I think there's been a huge emotional loss for him. I think his personality has completely changed from the minute the spill happened, for both of us. I'm sure he would tell you the same thing about me. I know I've changed. Before the spill, nothing ruffled him. He was Mr. Calm, Mr. Santa Claus. Now he's frustrated all the time, so angry, upset. And it happened immediately. I noticed it immediately. He's not a social person. He doesn't really like to be around people. He lived in Alberton, for God's sakes. But it was worse since the spill. But 4 years later, even considering his head injury, Hodges saw Hansen improving, becoming calmer, more like himself. And he was a very hard worker. That's what's made me so heartsick, she said. Because our financial problems are so bad, Mark could work his butt off every day and will never get out of debt. He's tried to work us out of debt, and he can't. They used to have savings accounts, good credit. I don't think he's really faced it. I don't know what we're going to do, because we're going to lose the house in Alberton, she said, the year before her settlement. Hodges had expected foreclosure long ago, but Hansen wouldn't talk about it. I guess he thinks it's a God-given right that if you buy a piece of property, they can't chase you off of it because it's toxic, that they wouldn't just expect you to take the loss. Working on distant road jobs seemed to help Hansen's health, and he noticed he didn't cough as much. But even in Alberton, he could be sick and still function, and accepted that as the price to keep the property. And I think his way of doing it is probably the average person's way of doing it, Hodges said. Most people in Alberton, whether they acknowledged it or not, made that trade-off. In order to stay, they're going to accept a lower quality of health, regardless of the long term. I know that Mark is conscious of that choice. He talks about it. He feels that he really doesn't have a choice. But I would argue that I don't think any piece of property is worth that. Still, it was hard to let go of her last connection to Alberton. Hodges told Mosca in 1998, I've been a gypsy person for my whole life until I came to Alberton, Montana, and I wanted to spend the rest of my life rebuilding an old dance hall and mercantile into a place where I could raise my kids and have a business. I liked the small town lifestyle. It really suited me. It was me. And it was Mark. We had very strong ties to the community. That's why it's worth a fight, because everything I had invested as an adult is at 520 Railroad Avenue. I loved Alberton. My whole life was invested there. Everything I'd ever worked for was in the place. Once that property is gone, I own nothing in this world, toxic or not. At least there is a place. You don't want to give that up because you don't know if you can ever get it again. There's a tremendous fear of being homeless, she said. But, practically speaking, Hodges had already lost her home. It's hard to explain that kind of investment and to have it all sitting there and not be able to touch it, she said, because chemicals are so misunderstood. People have an idea that, like Chernobyl, that if you went there today, it would be like a nuclear winter, that it would be blackened, but it's not like that. The irises are still blooming, the gardens are still sprouting up, the elk are still grazing. It's all still gorgeous, but that doesn't mean it's safe to live there. In the early days after the spill, Hodges never dreamed her life would come to this. You can't take a person's house away and say tough. It's America, but they did it. We didn't think it was possible, she said. Before spill, after spill. Hodges previously thought that town had been rising from the ashes of the Milwaukee Railroad, but the spill derailed that momentum. I feel that way, she said, besides getting my whole life off track. She could never get back on those rails. Alberton had seemed the town that time forgot, but she never would. Trask told Mosca in 1998 it was hard being in Missoula now. I don't like it here as much. It's just different. It's not Alberton anymore. Bigger and different. The lunches here are not as good. That's the biggest difference, he said. Before the spill happened, we used to go down to the river with our dog. He died after the spill, or we lost him. Smokey Joe. Now we can't go down there because it's too close to the tracks, the spill site. But more than old playgrounds and Smokey Joe had been lost, and life was harder regardless of the move to Missoula. Trask and his little brother could no longer run and bike, snowboard and swim with the unbounded energy and pleasure that was the natural right and inclination of every healthy child. The Missoula trailer, he thought, kind of small. In Alberton, Trask had a bedroom. Now he slept on a couch. His mom slept on the floor on a mattress. Had Mom changed since the spill? Mosca asked. She doesn't clean as much, he said. She works a lot finding out stuff. She doesn't cook as much. Lunches had suffered. Now 12, Trask was already forgetting much of his life in Alberton. To him, 2.5 years was a long time ago. But some things he still remembered and believed. "They poisoned our town," he said. "They knew about the track. Could have repaired it so it wouldn't have happened." Except for his family's ears and Mosca's camera, his story went unheard. The Hodges story was not every Alberton family story, yet one of many similar. The above account is a pale reflection of the day-to-day reality of living with chronic illness from chemical exposure over years. See the book to read further testimonies of Alberton spill victims' chronic illness. Next time on Gas, the true story of a toxic train derailment, we conclude the two-book series with a reflection and look forward from Lucinda Hodges, followed by some endnotes. Until then, this is Ron Scholl. Thanks for listening. This podcast is adapted from the book Gas, the true story of a toxic train derailment. Visit Amazon.com to see the two-book series. To access support material in the book, such as maps, photos, illustrations, and video links, visit my Facebook page Gas, the true story, or watch my Gas playlist on my YouTube channel at RL Scholl.